Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video from Amar Talks NRL SuperCoach. In today's video, we're going to be going through the teams that have the best opening round draws between rounds 1 to 6 to help set up your team when you start building it for the NRL SuperCoach season for 2024. If you do enjoy the video, do please give it a thumbs up. If you are new around here, please consider subscribing as well if you want to see more NRL SuperCoach content during the preseason as well as the 2024 season. So here I've got the draw for every single team between rounds 1 to 6, and of course I have to discuss this sporting my beautiful Amar Talks NRL SuperCoach t-shirt. Quick little plug for that. It's not merchandise, but if anyone else is interested in it, let me know and maybe I can look to make it available for purchase, but just for myself for the time being. Anywho, getting onto the draw. So I've actually got this draw ordered between rounds 1 to 6 for teams in difficulty in terms of easiest to worst. So you can see teams like the Titans, Sharks, Dragons, Dolphins, etc. That's ordered from easiest down to the worst. One thing I wanted to kind of point out with this was a lot of the top teams from last season do have quite tough starts where they do play each other towards the beginning of the season. So like look, for example, looking at the bottom four, Penrith, Broncos, Melbourne and the Roosters. Penrith and Broncos for that matter, the two grand finalists in that epic grand final from 2023. Melbourne and Roosters, typically historically very strong teams as well. And you've also got teams like the Rabbitohs and the New Zealand Warriors kind of featuring in that bottom half. So it is an interesting thing to note here, because I think something I'm guilty of as well. I focus sometimes a little bit too much on the draw and its importance to begin the season. Sometimes you just need to keep it simple and pick the players from the best teams. They should always come through and deliver. But it is something worth pointing out, I thought, for when you are building a team at the beginning of the season. Typically, a lot of the best players from these type of teams are going to be the very expensive ones. So maybe, looking at this draw difficulty, you think, do I go with someone like a Reece Walsh, or do I go with someone with like a Kalen Ponga instead? They feature quite differently in terms of difficulty here. If you're struggling to fit in someone like a Nathan Cleary, could you go without him, knowing he's got teams like Melbourne, Parramatta, who do typically play quite well against Penrith, and the Broncos, Roosters, Manly, and then a bye? Is there an argument to go without him? These are the kind of questions that you start need to asking yourself when you start digging into the draw in a little bit more detail. If you hadn't already seen one of my other preseason videos, just wanted to do a quick plug for my trade planner, team picker, and draw difficulty spreadsheets, which I'll put a link for in the description below for my tutorial video and how you can actually access those. I just wanted to quickly use the feature just to tell you how I'm going to go through the teams that I consider having the best draws, and using the spreadsheet just kind of as an example of how it can function. So one of the tabs I've got here is sorting difficulty for the first 6 rounds of the season. Very simply, I can just sort from Z to A, and that will show me from the best to worst if I sort Z to A here. Now you can see that then sorts, and it says the Titans come out on top, which I thought was quite interesting because buys do feature into the draw difficulty part of it, in that it generally tries to favor draws that don't have buys. But the Titans, albeit having a buy in round 2, Dragons, Bulldogs, Dolphins in the first 4, along with Cowboys and Canberra. It's a pretty good looking draw. They don't even face a really top team until like a grand finalist until the Broncos, and that's in round 12. So they've got a long stretch where they really don't face one of the top 2 teams. So I thought I just want to quickly show you how I use the spreadsheet into my videos and how it will be moving forward. And this can be available to you as well to access. As I said, I'll put links for that in the description below. And another final thing I wanted to note, the way that I've actually done that draw sorting in the example I just showed you, I actually looked at from 2023 which teams conceded the most number of 80-point scores throughout the entire season, and I've just showed that here for you as well. So the Bulldogs, the Dragons, and the Dolphins, and the Tigers, they actually all conceded the most number of 80-point scores to opposition players. Surprisingly, you've got teams that you'd probably consider as decent in the Cowboys, Parramatta Eels, in that kind of lower half as well. And obviously if you look to the lower half, you probably get a bit more familiar names in terms of Panthers and Broncos being the best 2 defenses, both from an NRL point of view and from a SuperCoach point of view as well. Then you've got the Rabbitohs, the Knights, the Warriors, Roosters, kind of a few more familiar teams who did perform decently well last season. This is kind of the way that I've used to kind of look at difficulty, looking at which teams conceded the most SuperCoach points. The reason I've just done that is, even though teams like Parramatta Eels, even though they finished 10th last season, we would typically consider them as a top 8 challenger. So a team you look at as pretty decent, but on their day they can still leak points, and that's really what we're interested in here, is scoring the most SuperCoach points. So starting off here, we have the Gold Coast Titans, who finished in 14th in 2023. I've also noted a few ins and outs into their team. Not too much movement. I put Des Hasler as a big in, given that he's the new coach for the team coming into this season. Keenan Palacia and Harley Smith-Shields, and not too many major kind of absent or outs from the Gold Coast Titans. And what I've done for each team, I've kind of listed some of the notable players, kind of some of the discussion points as well coming into the season. This video won't be focusing too much on the players, more on the teams themselves in terms of the draw difficulty, but we will talk briefly about some players. So Gold Coast Titans, as you saw with my spreadsheet, do come out on top. And if you look at the kind of draw, it probably does make sense with a home game against the Dragons opening up. The round 2 bye does make things a little bit difficult to navigate because you kind of want to go in hard on the Titans if you really do think that they're going to have a good, strong start to the season. They historically are a team that can score points. Their issues typically always been defense. And so they are a team that we hopefully can look to score some SuperCoach points early on. Round 1 really good, and round 3 onwards away to the Bulldogs as well, who are very kind of, they've got a lot of squad changeover, so they're probably a team that will take some time to gel. So at the early point in the season, could be a good team to target. Dolphins, despite kind of having a really impressive season for what a lot of people expected, they still conceded a fair few amount of SuperCoach points. And then we know the Cowboys and Canberra Raiders, they're tough ones to assess because hopefully you think that that'd be the Canberra Raiders, for example, were in the top 8. Cowboys had a very disappointing season last year, but I guess it's the first kind of 3 matchups of Dragons, Bulldogs and Dolphins that we'd be really targeting. Dave Fifita, he is the outright best second row forward. He's a bit of a tricky one to kind of use to capitalize on that kind of opening start because he's going to be coming off a pec injury in the offseason, so kind of uses that he's kind of racing the clock to be fit for round 1. Someone like a Tino, I think he's quite expensive for the front row forward position, but he is the best averaging front row forward from last season. Having that much money early on, missing in round 2, if you've got adequate cover, there's definitely a strong case to go for Tino, but I can probably see a lot of people not going for Tino given that they do have that round 2 bye. The backs is a little bit more interesting. AJ Brimson, again, he's probably not going to be one I think a lot of people will consider. The news is that he's probably likely going to be playing in the centres, but he's only listed at fullback for SuperCoach. Now, if he keeps playing centre wing, it's likely that in the SuperCoach game itself, he probably will get centre wing eligibility. At that point, he's maybe interesting. But again, the tricky thing with that is that typically only happens the first instance in round 6, and you're kind of missing out on some of the best games in that period of time. Bo Fermor is definitely an interesting one. Not last season, he was out all with an ACL injury. He had a pretty good 2022 season. If he gets named on the left, playing outside of Kieran Foran, we saw what that did for Dave Fifita, really unlocked his attacking upside. Someone like Bo Fermor in that pretty impressive 2022 season, I can see him being a very popular second row forward player and pretty good price as well, 467k. And I think he's probably someone who, in a second row forward position where you're able to have a few more players on the bench to come in and cover, someone like Fermor in that round 2 bye, I think he's someone who I'm definitely looking at starting in my squad for round 1, especially if he gets playing on the left. We know the Titans are an attacking team. He's someone you can see kind of providing really good value at the start of the season with some good matchups. And Jaden Campbell, again, an interesting one. We know what is such an exciting and live wire of a player he is. SuperCoach, it's difficult because 5'8" fullback, those are 2 high upside positions. I've got another video coming out soon that will go a little bit more into detail in terms of what are the best SuperCoach positions. 5'8" and fullback are definitely some of the standouts. And someone like a Jaden Campbell, who's coming in at a good price, probably doesn't have the most SuperCoach friendly game, or we just haven't quite seen it historically. You could take the punt on him, given that the Titans have got this really good opening start. But that's the issue with him, again, is more the position that he's being named in for SuperCoach point of view. So it's kind of tough with the Titans. They've got that really good draw. That buy in round 2, though, is going to be a little bit tricky to navigate, especially if you're spending big on someone like Tino. I like Bo Fermor because he's in a position that you can be able to cover him. Someone like a Brian Kelly is coming in pretty expensive at 650k, but that was on the back of a 64 average. So he could be someone that you could look to if you are willing to spend a little bit more in your center wing position as well. So I think overall, Titans, I'm definitely curious and definitely want to invest in, given that really good start to the season. They are an attacking team as well. That round 2 bye, though, just gets a little bit tough to navigate. So I feel like I can really only see myself starting with one of them, and that's probably likely going to be Bo Fermor. Next up, I've got the Cronulla Sharks, a very SuperCoach relevant team. 2023 ladder position of 6th. We know on their day as well, they get that moniker of being the flat track bully. Look, whether or not you respect that from an NRL point of view, from a SuperCoach point of view, all that means is if they've got easy games, I want Sharks players, and they're going to score a lot of points, hopefully. Someone like a Nico Hines, I think he just stands out straight away. He was the highest averaging and I believe highest scoring player for 2023. He's 970k, so it won't come cheap. But the way I look at it, as even though he's got a bye in round 5, I look at round 2 and I look at round 3, home to the Bulldogs and away to the West Tigers. I look at that as, yeah, I think I'm going to want to captain Nicho Hynes, and I think in a couple of those games. Warriors away is tough, definitely. That is going to be an away game in New Zealand for round 1, which is obviously going to be quite an occasion, quite an exciting game. But then after that, 2 of the next 3 games at home, Canberra Raiders. He's definitely, that they're a team that can still concede points. And Hynes, I'm going to use the standard phrase for describing him, the ultimate accumulator of points. Even in these tough games, he just seems to manage to get points irrespective. So I'll look at round 2, round 3. 2 games I'm definitely going to want to captain him, I think. And even though he's got that bye in round 5, I still look at him as someone I think must have is tough to say for any player. But yeah, he's close to it when I look at those round 2 and 3 matchups. I think outside of Nicho Hynes, who I think is going to be obviously very, very popular to begin the season, kind of got a few other names here. Britton Nikora in your second row forward. Again, we'll touch on the second row forward in a lot more detail in future videos. It's a position that I'm not seeing a lot of people spend money in their early team builds, because I think there's just so much value in that kind of 400 to 500k range. But if you are someone who is willing to spend up big in their second row forward and you're not going to go for a Fafita, Britton Nikora had a great season last year, just averaging a tick under 70. He had a lot of attacking upside, and in these kind of easy games, Nicho Hynes plays all across the field. You can definitely see Nikora benefiting as well. So it could be someone to start hot to begin the season. So I definitely haven't ruled him out of my thinking. Will Kennedy at 664k was a kind of a solid performer throughout the entirety of the season. I had him for brief spells. You kind of need to really target him, I think, for the good runs, which, rounds 2 to 6, you'd say, for the Sharks definitely is a good run. The buy in round 5 probably isn't ideal. I do see that, a lot of people are going to look at fullback and say, well, Ryan Papenhuyzen is very similarly priced to Will Kennedy. I think I'm just going to go Papenhuyzen instead, which I completely get. So Will Kennedy, despite the good draw, I don't expect to see in a lot of teams at the beginning of the season. In your center wing, if again you're willing to spend up a little bit more, Ronaldo Mulitalo was very frustrating at times for a lot of people because he scored well, and then when people brought him in, he just really didn't do much. He's kind of one of those guys I feel like you just need to hold for a decent spell of time to really get to ride the waves of his good scores and probably some of his bad ones. But those 2 games, again, round 2, 3, Bulldogs, West Tigers, you can see Mulitalo scoring well. So again, a play that you could consider. And I like the Sharks overall. Just they're a very settled team. If I look at the ins and outs, the only major outs is Wade Graham to retirement, Matt Moylan to the Super League, and Connor Tracy's gone to the Bulldogs, and coming in Billy Burns. But really, the spine of that team is pretty settled. I like the fact that squad is going to be fairly consistent, so you kind of know what you're going to get from them. Again, another reason why I'm happy to invest in Nicho Hynes and maybe add on to someone like a Britton Nikora as well, if I want to try to benefit a little bit more from the Sharks' good start to the year. Third team on my list here is the Parramatta Eels. Overall, probably a disappointing season, I think, for the Eels, given the high hopes of reaching the grand final in 2022, 10th in 2023. A few ins and outs for them. The major ins are Kelma Tuolangi and Morgan Harper. But again, these are, the center wing position and the second row forward. Their spine, though, is probably going to be fairly settled. Apart from the number 9, actually, number 9 spot is probably going to be split between Brendan Hands and someone like a Joey Lussick. But the fact that you've got Clint Gutherson, Dylan Brown, Mitchell Moses, they're the ones who are really going to be running the show. They're all still going to be there as well. And with Parramatta Eels, bit of a mixed draw. Bulldogs away, not Bulldogs away. I think that's actually Bulldogs at home. Sorry, apologies. That should be all caps. But Bulldogs at home in round 1. Penrith in round 2 is going to be tough, but I feel like it's not a bad time to be versing the Panthers. If you want to kind of build a narrative in your head, Penrith at the beginning of the season, they'll be riding the high of a three-peat. Do they maybe come out of the gates a little bit slower and they kind of build into the season? And as I mentioned kind of earlier in the video, Eels seem to be a team who can perform well against Penrith. And then you've got Manly, West Tigers, Canberra, and the Cowboys, so no buys in the first 6 weeks as well. For me personally, someone like a Dylan Brown in 5'8", I think he's probably going to be almost close to a lock in my round 1 team. I just look at him as a super consistent player. I think he averaged, his base average was like 37 last year, so like the worst you're ever going to get from Dylan Brown is probably going to be like 50 to 55. You throw in these good games, we know he can easily hit the 80 and then get those tons if he gets few more attacking stats. Clint Gutherson, he had a really good season last year, 79 average, and was one of the top scorers as well, given that he played mostly through the season, apart from he missed that game through Origin. And Mitchell Moses as well was a really consistent performer as well. Started the season very strong, had a bit of a lull, but then really kicked it up around mid-season, kind of around that Origin period as well. So someone like a Mitchell Moses, I kind of mentioned it briefly at the beginning of the video, maybe if you want to avoid someone like a Cleary, I like Moses. 695k does actually feel like a pretty decent price for a 68 average player who we know when he's got good games as the goal kicker, he can definitely go big and get those 80, 90, definitely into the 100 scores as well. So I'm personally eyeing up Dylan Brown, Mitchell Moses quite heavily for my round 1 team. There is a bit of a risk, obviously, going pretty strong for those two players, but kind of feels like maybe a bit of a point of difference. I feel like Dylan Brown's going to be really popular at 5'8", but maybe you can double up with Mitch Moses, and maybe that's your advantage. Jermaine Hopgood obviously had a stellar 2023 season. I figure he's not going to be very popular given the high price tag, and you probably see, can he really match 73? Probably, but is he going to exceed that more and provide you value at the start of the season, and especially when our salary caps are a bit tight? That's probably the different story. The value though is Shaun Lane. Obviously had a great 2022 season playing off the edge of Dylan Brown. Last season though had some injury problems, so only averaged 43, and he's coming in a price tag of 446k. Expect to see Shaun Lane very, very popular in round 1, given that they've got these really good games to start the season apart from that Penrith game, and that really good price tag for Shaun Lane. I can see him being very, very popular as well. I mentioned Brendan Hands. He's probably going to be someone who I think a lot of people are going to go with Jaden Brayley instead at hooker as the backup to someone like a Harry Grant or maybe a Jeremy Marshall-King. He's kind of one I think you really have to look at the trial, see kind of what the minute split is at hooker. He did play 80 minutes a few times on occasion last season, but even then he wasn't a stellar scorer, so probably not going to be the most popular option for round 1. But for me, Parramatta Eels, pretty good start to the season. Are they going to try to bounce back? And for me, I look at their big guns in Dylan Brown, Mitchell Moses, and I think of good value pick in Shaun Lane. They're kind of who I'm really eyeing up. Clint Gutherson, I think it really depends on how he comes back from injury, but definitely should not be discounted as well. 807k is a high price tag, but I think he showed last season that he is probably worth that price tag as well, given how influential he is to the Parramatta Eels. And with a really good run of games, he could also be someone who starts well to begin the season. Next team up, I've got the Dolphins. So 13th in 2023, but I think given how the expectation was on them to begin last season, 13th probably feels like a good season for the Dolphins. And they seem to have had a really good offseason as well. A few good inclusions: Jake Averillo, Herbie Farnworth, and Tom Flegler in the front row forward position. Apart from round 3 bye though, they've got a really nice run of games for the first 5 weeks. So Cowboys at home, Dragons at home, really, really solid, especially that Dragons at home game. Then they've got the Titans away, but an away trip to the Titans is down the road for the Dolphins, so it's still in Queensland. And then you've got the West Tigers at home in round 5, before the Broncos away in round 6. And even then, I look at that round 6 game against the Broncos, it's kind of that local derby as well. You kind of feel like they're going to want to step up for that game. So when I look at everything in face value, that round 3 bye, it's a similar narrative to what I said for the Titans. It's going to be a little bit tricky to navigate round 3. But I really think outside of that, it's a really strong start for the Dolphins. And I think they've had a really good offseason of acquisitions. We know being coached by Wayne Bennett, what we saw last season was a lot of consistent performances. They didn't seem to really... They had some spells where they were, a little bit poorer. But I think a lot of that was due to injuries. I think when they started losing a few of their key men, you really saw the lack of depth kind of starting to test them. But when they had their full contingent, they were definitely competitive. And I think if that's the case, come round 1, I think that's still a team that's worth investing in. Jeremy Marshall-King at hooker, I think he's probably one who, if you're not going for someone like Harry Grant, who himself has a bye in round 4, I like Jeremy Marshall-King to start the season. He's probably coming in at slightly under at an average of 62.6. Remember, a lot of that was hampered by he had some AC joint shoulder issues. If he's kind of gone past that and he's recovered, in the period of last season when he didn't have that, he was kind of getting to the 65, 66, if not this closer to the 70 average in some games. So I like him as maybe a point of difference at your hooker spot for a gun, and he comes in much cheaper as well than Harry Grant, who I believe is around the 750k mark. So Jeremy Marshall-King I do like as a hooker consideration. I think if you're going and spending a lot in your center wing, Jermaine Osako is probably the guy for you. Had an amazing 2023 season, 76.7. Goal kicking obviously is a big plus for him. I think he was the top point scorer last season as well for 2023. I find it personally tough, I think, to fit in Osako when I'm probably going to want to spend big in other positions like my halves, my fullback, getting someone in like a Dylan Brown as well. 783k, it's a lot of money. And I know the games are good, but just seeing that round 3 bye also kind of turns me off. And I feel like hopefully maybe he's someone I can pen in for round 4 or round 5 potentially. That's kind of how I'm looking at Jermaine Osako at the moment. But I definitely can't fault people if they want to start the season with a primo in the center wing position. then Osaka could be the guy for you. Herbie Farnworth had a good season for the Broncos as well, and it looks like a nice pickup for the Dolphins. 632k. Doesn't feel like he's going to offer like amazing value. I feel like that 62 is probably what you're going to get from him. But if you want to buy into a good hot start for the Dolphins, he could be someone to consider. And I've got Hamiso Tabuai-Fidow as well, who started last season actually very strong, coming in at 600k. Average of 59, that probably feels like what you're more or less going to get from him as well. But overall, I think the Dolphins, I really like their individual matchups when I break them down a little bit further. That round 3 bye, though, is probably the biggest issue, I guess. But I really like Jeremy Marshall-King, especially if you've got a solid backup in someone like a Jaden Braley. If it's just for the 1 week, I think Marshall-King can offer that upside to warrant picking him, despite him having that round 3 bye. And I think premium center wing in Jermaine Osako, I look at those two as kind of really good guys, I think, to begin the season with, and in the Dolphins, and they're a really good start. So the next team that I've got are the Newcastle Knights, who I think, for me personally, one of the biggest surprise packets of last season. After mid-season, essentially moving Kalen Ponga to fullback, and him saying, no, I'm not going to play Origin, I'm just going to focus on the Knights, and it completely transformed their season. And he was probably my favorite player to own, I think, last season, Kalen Ponga, because I think I picked him up around round 16, just when he had started this little run, and then he just went to become the $1 million man, and he had a season average of 87, but I think if I broke down the numbers a little bit more, if you look at his average when he was playing at fullback, I'm sure it was around the mid-90s. Like, he was just absolutely insane, and he was goal kicking as well. They have lost a few players, Dom Young, Lockie Fitzgibbon, but a few ins as well, probably more kind of squad players like Jack Cogger, Jed Cartwright, Tom Jenkins from the Penrith Panthers, and a couple of boys from the English Super League as well. But again, you think of the spine, Jaden Braley coming in, it's probably only going to be either the same as what Phoenix Crossland offered last season, if not maybe an improvement. Ponga, surely there's no way he's going to be playing at 5'8" this season. I think we can all agree fullback is the spot, and he should be playing there. And then amazing electric outside backs in Greg Marzu and Dane Gagai. I mean, losing Dom Young, I mean, even though he was maybe not the most consistent from a Supercoach point of view, really good for the Knights. He always just seemed to be like a bit of an outlet as well in transition. But, you know, I'm sure they'll find some young speedster to replace him. If not, more ball for Greg Marzu, who, again, one of my favorite players to own from last season. I think I had picked him up in round 3, and he just killed it for the remainder of the season, averaging 77. I believe he was the highest averaging centre wing from last season. Just digging into the draw a little bit for the Knights. On paper, to me, it doesn't read like the best draw, because Canberra at home, Cowboys, Melbourne, New Zealand, Dragons, and Roosters. The reason I wanted to put in the Knights, though, was that I really like their home games. Canberra at home, I think, is a really good, strong start to begin the season. Cowboys away, probably not the easiest. Melbourne is obviously going to be tough, but it is a home game, so I think there's still something in there that they are playing at home. Warriors away is probably going to be tough. Round 5 is a money fixture. You know, Dragons at home, you can look at that and say that's an automatic kind of Kalen Ponga VC or captain, and then Roosters at home. So they've got four home games to begin the opening 6. And then they've got the Cowboys and Warriors away. The reason I've put in the Knights is that if on my draw sorting spreadsheet, you actually look at the first 8 rounds, the Knights actually shoot up to number 1. Because in round 7 and rounds 8, they then got the Bulldogs, and then they've got the Dolphins. So that's kind of the main reason I wanted to include the Knights. I know we're looking at only the first 6 rounds of the season, but I'm kind of looking at, you know, if people are eyeing up someone like a Ponga, he really looks like someone I think you can kind of set and forget from the beginning of the season, because you can kind of ride it through for the first kind of 2 to 3 weeks, and then from round 5 onwards, I think you want to target KP, because then you've got a spell of Dragons, Roosters at home, then you've got the Bulldogs, and then the Dolphins away, New Zealand, but then you've got Tigers, and then you've got Titans. So really the run up until the first bye is pretty enticing for the Newcastle Knights. So I can see myself starting with Ponga, because I look at them as a good long-term pick. Marzu maybe not so much because of the high price tag, but we do know that Marzu is really good on the base stats, so he can be someone who can still perform well. And someone like a Gagai is a similar mold as well. But the reason I wanted to highlight the Knights was I think they've got a good set of home games. KP just had an amazing season. I can definitely see him kind of, I mean, it's hard to maintain the performances he had, but even a small drop-off, even if it's a 5-point drop-off for Ponga, he's still going to be averaging 82. I'll take someone who averages 82, and then he's going to be someone I'm going to have from round 5 onwards. So can you maybe save the trade and just have him to begin the season? I think it's a pretty reasonable strategy. But yeah, amazing team last year, the Knights, and let's see if they can pick that up as well for the beginning of 2024. Kind of now on the opposite end of the spectrum, we've got the St. George Dragons, who had a pretty poor season last year, coming in 16th. A few changes there, obviously a new coach in Shane Flanagan. Carl Flanagan's coming in as well. Tom Eisenhuth, Corey Allen actually unfortunately has picked up an ACL injury. So a few fringe players there. Harm Saleh will bolster their front row forward. A few outs as well in Jaden Sullivan to the West Tigers, and also Zane Musgrove. The reason, though, that I've wanted to highlight the Dragons, they do have on paper still some good matchups for the first 6 weeks. Titans, Dolphins, and then the West Tigers are pretty good away games. And then you've got Cowboys, Manly at home. Now, Newcastle is obviously going to be tough in round 5. So some decent matchups on paper there for the Dragons. I'm still personally not going to be too keen, I think, on starting with them, given the number of changes in the team, a new coach as well. There probably is going to be some transition period of time for them to actually get accustomed to the way that he wants to play. And, in general, they've been a pretty poor team as well over the last few seasons. Still thought worth highlighting someone like a Zach Lomax, for example. I know in previous seasons he has been a bit of a SuperCoach darling. He is a goal kicker, so that is something definitely in his favour for the Dragons. Average of 61.8 last season as well. There is some talk that he could play at fullback, which I think if he does play at fullback, that makes him a lot more enticing in my opinion. And I think I look at it as if he's going to be named at fullback and he's going to be goal kicking for a team that hopefully is improving with a few good matchups in the first 6 weeks, maybe he's someone that you could take a punt on in your center wing at 630k. So you're not paying that 700 plus price tag, and you're hopefully getting some value to begin the season, because he does seem like a player who, even when the Dragons are poor, that goal kicking helps him kind of maintain some 50 to 55 scores. So he's not going to give you dud scores in your center wing, and he has got that ability to go big as well. And I like the fact that if he was playing at fullback, the upside is probably more likely going to be there. Outside of that, though, there's probably not too many players I think I'm going to be interested in from the Dragons. Got Ben Hunt in your halfback, but halfback to me is a really stacked position. Jack DeBellin could be a solid kind of plotter for you in your second row forward or your front row forward. And Tyrell Sloan, I think a lot of people saw it last season. He has his highs, but when the lows come, those lows are pretty low. And so I think I personally probably don't have the stomach to ride that kind of roller coaster. So I'm probably not going to be starting, I think, with someone like Tyrell Sloan. And the Dragons wanted to highlight that they do have some good games, but again, there's a lot that we need to kind of see in the preseason or in terms of improved performances. But I think we can kind of really commit to saying, yep, I want to start with some of their players to capitalize on some good matchups to begin the season. Final team that I wanted to talk about was the North Queensland Cowboys. A very disappointing 2023 season, finishing in 11th compared to 2022 when they finished in 3rd and were incredible. What I like about them is similar to what I said about the Sharks. Very stable squad. The only notable players they've got in is Viliami Valia from the New Zealand Warriors, and Jake Clifford has returned to them as well. In terms of outs, you've got James Tarmo, Peter Hiku, Ben Hampton, and Brendan Elliott. Not too many major names. The spine of that team is going to be pretty consistent with Reece Robson, Scott Drinkwater, Chad Townsend, and Tom Dearden in the spine. So I think it's a pretty stable setup there. A lot of good kind of quality players in their team as well, like Ruben Cotter, Hylam Lukey, Valentine Holmes, etc. There's quite a few good players in that team. And I think what we should hope for with the Cowboys is that they kind of improve, have a strong preseason. For more reports, they're having a really solid preseason. And, last year, a lot of us started with Cowboys players because they had a really good run to begin the season and they were kind of disappointing. I'm kind of hoping that weighs in on people's minds, because I look at the draw and I think Dolphins away is fine. Knights at home, at least it's a home game for them. Dragons is obviously a good matchup. Broncos is tough, but at least, again, it's a home game. Titans at home, we know the Titans can concede points. And then Parramatta away, who, Parramatta, as we saw in the graphic earlier in the video, they are prone to conceding points as well. So I think I look at some of those matchups and think, at least the home games, the tough games are at home, and then the good games are away. So I kind of look at that as, that's not too bad. I think of a bit of a mixed draw, but overall I don't think it's too bad. And because of the good quality players that they've got in their squad, Scott Drinkwater had an incredible last season, so I think he's probably going to be a fullback who I think is probably going to be on the lower owned spectrum. So if you're looking for a point of difference, Scott Drinkwater could be a really good pod in your fullback spot. Valentine Holmes, 736k. We know what he can deliver, average 72, but he has got those big scores in him, given that he is goal kicking. I like the look of someone in their second or forward like Lukey. We know Lukey's got some attacking upside. Jeremiah Nanai kind of fits the bill too at 583k. It's not too expensive, and we know that he can deliver some high upside games. We've got Tom Dearden at 5'8", if you really wanted to go pod, because Tom Dearden for actually a fair chunk of last season was averaging fairly well, but he does have those low games, which overall kind of brought his average down. And I've got Zach Labart, who only played, I think, 4 games last season, but he averaged 57. So he could be a nice value pick in center wing for 465k with some of these decent games coming up. And hopefully he gets a center wing position now that Petahiku has left the club. So the Cowboys are an intriguing team to me. I feel like they've got some decent value prospects like Ruben Cotter, for example, at a pretty good price. I like Lukey, something like a Nanai as well, and a couple of pods there as well. I think Drinkwater is going to be a pod in fullback who I can see a lot of people starting with Turbo, Ponga, Reece Walsh and Pappenhausen. I feel like Drinkwater is not going to feature too much in that conversation. And Val Holmes for a bit of a premium center wing, some decent matchups there. And I think really for Cowboys, it comes down to how much do you trust the strong preseason that they're going to have. Because last season they had a pretty interrupted preseason. They came off a really strong 2022, and then they had a lot of players featuring in kind of international rep footy. So I think that probably disrupted their 2023 season. By all reports, if they do have a strong preseason this year, they could come out to a good start, because I do think that they are a quality team that should improve from that position of 11th this season. So a team that I am definitely still interested in, and maybe a good team to go pod hunting. Alright guys, that is my wrap up of the teams that I consider to have the best opening draw to begin the season. Do hope you enjoyed the video. Do please give it a thumbs up if you liked it, and do please consider subscribing as well if you want to see more videos through the preseason and the 2024 SuperCoach season. And I'll see you all in the next one. Cheers.